Somewhere in a Templar commandery in Languedoc, late in the 12th century, on the night before a column rode out toward a battlefield, cups were passed down a long table in silence. The wine inside was diluted, dark with aloe pulp, and warm with the resin of a plant the Sufis of the Holy Land called Holy Jerusalem. The textbooks will tell you the Templar drank wine in moderation, governed by the primitive rule of 1129, sworn to discipline and faith. For 7 centuries, that was the answer. A warrior monk, a goblet, an austere life lived close to the edge of a sword. Then modern toxicology and ancient DNA reopened the case. Almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. The drink was not what we were told. The men were not who we were told. And their descendants are still walking France. To understand what the modern evidence overthrown, you have to first understand what the evidence was overturning. And that means going back to the battlefield record itself, the documented combat history of an order whose military reputation was, by the standards of the 12th and 13th centuries, statistically impossible. In November of 1177, near the town of Montgisard in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a force of roughly 500 Templar knights and several thousand infantry encountered the army of Saladin. The Muslim force numbered more than 26,000 men. The engagement that followed was not a defensive holding action. It was a Templar-led charge that broke the Ayyubid line and sent Saladin retreating into the Sinai with a fraction of the army he had brought north. The battle entered Crusader chronicles as a disproportionate Christian victory, and the Templar role at the head of the line was the central tactical fact of the engagement. They were the spearhead. The mathematics of the battle was that they should not have been able to do what they did. Montgisard was not an outlier. The pattern repeated. At Cresson in 1187, at Arsuf in 1191, at Le Fourbier in 1244, the Templar role was consistent. They were the heavy cavalry deployed at the front of the column, the shock troops who absorbed the first impact of an engagement and broke the enemy formation by force of charge. They wore mail in desert heat. They fought against numerically superior forces with documented success rates that no other Crusader force matched. And the men who led them, the senior officers of the order, lived into ages that the demography of the period made nearly inexplicable. Hugues de Payan, one of the founders of the order, lived into his 60s. Robert de Craon, his successor as Grand Master, did the same. Armand de Périgord, Thibaut Gaudin, Geoffrey de Charnay, all into their 60s. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the order, was burned alive in Paris in March of 1314 at the age of 70. The average life expectancy for a man who survived to the age of 20 in the 13th century Europe was 48. The Templar leadership was outliving the demographic baseline by 20 years and more, and they were doing it while engaged in continuous warfare in a disease-saturated environment 2,000 miles from home. The official explanation lived inside a single document. The primitive rule of the Templars, drafted at the Council of Troyes in 1129 under the supervision of Bernard of Clairvaux, governed every aspect of the order's daily life. 2 meals a day, taken in silence. Scripture read aloud during the meal. Meat 3 times a week. Wine permitted, diluted, taken in moderation. Drunkenness punished by penance. Repeated drunkenness by expulsion. The rule was reinforced by 3 additional documents: the hierarchical statutes, the penances, and the retraits, which extended its provisions into the institutional life of the order. The image that emerged from these documents, and the image that survives in popular history, is of the warrior monk as ascetic, disciplined, sober, fed plainly, whose longevity and battlefield record were attributed in medieval chronicle and in modern scholarship to the supposed virtue of his daily life. The Catholic scholar Francesco Franceschi recorded the medieval consensus that the longevity of the Templar knights was a divine gift, granted to men whose discipline had earned it. The rule was the visible document. The rule was, for most of the 8 centuries since the order's destruction, the only document anyone consulted. The problem was that the rule did not explain the combat record. Discipline did not explain why a Templar charge at Montgisard broke an army 50 times its size. Moderation did not explain why the senior officers of the order outlived their contemporaries by a generation. A diet of bread and fish and diluted wine did not explain how men in mail charged into the heat of the Levantine summer and survived wounds that killed everyone else. Something was happening inside the order that the rule did not record, and that something was being administered in the Holy Land and in the southern French commanderies in the cup. The rule was the visible document. It was not the only document. And what was being mixed into the wine in the preceptories and on the eve of battle was nowhere in the text the Council of Troyes had approved. The question that modern researchers have spent the last 50 years working through is what was actually in the cup. The trail begins not in a French archive, but in a chain of secondary scholarship stretching across the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The phrase elixir of Jerusalem, the name attached to the drink in question, surfaces in 3 principal works. Mark Schweitzer, in his 1994 study of medicinal aloe, recorded the recipe as palm wine, aloe, pulp, and hashish, and attributed its use to the Templars during the Crusader period. Peter Barcroft and Odin Miskia, in their 2003 work on aloe vera and herbal medicine, repeated the attribution with the same 3 ingredients and the same name. Camillo di Chico, a Roman dermatologist, included the formulation in his 2015 book, Heresy and Science in the Middle Ages, identifying the aloe specifically as aloe arborescens, valued in the medieval Levant for its antiseptic and bactericidal properties and its capacity to penetrate the deeper layers of the skin. The reconstruction is contested. The ingredients are not. The cultural pipeline that would have carried such a drink into Templars practice is documented in detail. The Templars maintained a presence in the Holy Land for nearly 2 centuries. Several of their officers were fluent in Arabic. They had direct access to the medical traditions of the Islamic world, including the Canon of Medicine of Avicenna, the most influential pharmacological text in medieval Europe and the Mediterranean. The order's known practice of adopting Arab medical innovations is independently established. Mandatory hand-washing before meals, the separation of food preparation from the care of the sick, the use of dedicated clean tables for the wounded, all of these appear in the Templar regulations decades before germ theory and centuries before they became standard in European medicine. The pipeline by which Arab pharmacological knowledge entered the order existed and was actively used. The hemp component connects to a specific medieval Islamic context. Franz Rosenthal, in his 1971 study of medieval Islamic drug literature, documented that Sufi groups in the same period and region used the term Holy Jerusalem as a euphemism for hashish. Cannabis was cultivated across the eastern Mediterranean throughout the medieval period. Its analgesic, anti-inflammatory, and dissociative properties were cataloged in the Arabic medical literature that the Templars demonstrably consulted. The aloe plant and the hemp, grown around the Alamut fortress in northern Persia, were considered by the Ismaili tradition to be components of an elixir of long life. The conceptual frame in which a wine, an antiseptic plant, and an analgesic herb were combined into a single ritual preparation existed in the Islamic world the Templars were embedded in. The order did not have to invent it. The order had to translate it. The aloe component is the most independently documented. Aloe vera in the medieval Levant was a working antiseptic, prescribed in Egyptian medical papyri for wound treatment and recorded in Mesopotamian sources for its disinfectant properties. The Templars, operating in a war zone where wound infection killed more men than steel, would have had every reason to incorporate it into a daily preparation. The historical record places aloe in their pharmacopoeia consistently, and the modern clinical literature on the antibacterial action of aloe arborescens against the gram-positive bacteria most responsible for medieval wound infections supports the medical logic of its inclusion. The palm wine component is geographic. In the Holy Land, palm wine was the available fermented base, and its inclusion in the original Levantine formulation reflects local agriculture. After the Templar withdrawal from the East and the consolidation of the order's operations in southern France, the recipe migrated. Grape wine replaced palm wine. The base changed. The additives did not. The Templar preceptories of Languedoc, Provence, and the Rhône Valley, documented in the Code Divino regional records as standardizing winemaking and incorporating regional herbs into ritual wine, were continuing the same institutional practice that had begun in the Holy Land, with the available base liquid of southern France. The Reconstruction has limits, and they are worth stating. No primary medieval Templar source explicitly names the elixir of Jerusalem as a Templar drink. The recipe is reconstructed from secondary scholarship, from contemporaneous Sufi practice, and from the order's documented engagement with Arab medical knowledge. What survives in the primary record is the rule, which permits diluted wine, and the Code Divino's documentation of additives. What does not survive in the primary record is a single text in which a Templar officer writes down the formula. The recipe lives in the inference, not the text. But the inference is well anchored. A drink that combined a fermented base, a battlefield antiseptic, and an analgesic herb with documented dissociative properties would have produced a specific physiological profile. Modern toxicology can describe what. The pharmacological case for the reconstructed elixir does not rest on speculation. Each of the three principal ingredients has a clinical literature behind it, and when the documented effects of the ingredients are mapped against the documented combat record of the order, the fit is item by item. The cannabis component is the most extensively studied. The active compounds in hemp, tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol, act on the endocannabinoid system, a regulatory network present throughout the human central and peripheral nervous systems. The clinical literature on cannabis-mediated analgesia is large and consistent. In significant doses, cannabis produces a measurable elevation of the pain threshold, suppression of the inflammatory response to tissue damage, mild dissociation between the sensation of pain and the emotional response to it, and a reduction in the acute fear response associated with anticipated injury. In a pre-modern combat context, on the eve of a charge, the relevant outputs are specific. A man who had consumed cannabis in a moderate dose would feel pain less, react to it more slowly, fear the next blow less acutely, and sustain damage that an unmedicated man would have had to stop fighting to address. The dissociative analgesia of cannabis is the same general class of effect that henbane produced for the Norse berserker, generated through a different chemical pathway, but with overlapping behavioral output. The aloe component does something different. Aloe vera contains a class of compounds called anthraquinones, alongside polysaccharides and a range of phenolic constituents, and its action is primarily antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory rather than psychoactive. Modern clinical studies have documented its effectiveness against the gram-positive bacteria most responsible for medieval wound infections, including Staphylococcus aureus and several Streptococcus species. Oral consumption of aloe over extended periods has been associated with reduced systemic inflammation and improved gut barrier function, both of which would have contributed to general resistance to the chronic infections that killed most medieval people in their 30s and 40s. A Templar consuming aloe-infused wine daily would have been carrying, in his bloodstream and his digestive tract, a continuous low-level antimicrobial load. In an environment where a minor wound from a sword cut or a pressure sore from mail could open into a fatal sepsis within days, that load was a survival edge. The palm wine and later the grape wine contributed their own profile. Ethanol in moderate doses produces mild anxiolytic effects, the well-documented reduction in social and situational anxiety that has made wine a feature of pre-combat ritual across most documented warrior cultures. The fermented base also provided caloric density, B vitamins, and antimicrobial action against the waterborne pathogens that contaminated most medieval water supplies. The Templar rule's permission of diluted wine, even read in isolation, makes hydration sense in a period when wine was simply safer than water. The diluted wine, when it carried aloe and hemp, was doing more than hydrating. The combined profile of the three ingredients consumed daily and an elevated dose before combat produces a specific kind of soldier, less reactive to pain, less prone to acute fear, more resistant to wound infection, better hydrated and fed than enemy forces drinking contaminated water, less susceptible to the chronic systemic inflammation that shortened most medieval lives. The man who emerges from this pharmacological pipeline is not a different species. He is an ordinary man whose body has been continuously buffered against the specific conditions that killed his contemporaries. The combat record matched the chemistry. The disproportionate Templar success at Montgisard becomes less mysterious when the men charging at the head of the column had elevated pain thresholds and suppressed fear responses. The willingness of Templar formations to absorb the first impact of an engagement and break enemy lines by force of charge fits a pharmacology in which the cost of being wounded was, at the moment of contact, less subjectively present. The senior officers of the order, outliving their contemporaries by 20 years, tracks with the documented effects of long-term, low-dose antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory exposure on the chronic disease burden of the medieval period. The rule said wine in moderation. The wine in question was doing more than the rule described, and what it was doing was specific, measurable, and consistent with the historical record. The fit was not approximate, it was item by item. Where the rule produced an image of austere discipline, the pharmacology produced a buffered combatant. Where the medieval chronicler attributed Templar longevity to a divine gift, the chemistry attributed it to a daily dose of antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory agents. The pharmacological case was strong. The next question was whether anything physical survived that proved the recipe had actually been administered. The evidence arrived from the ground, and it arrived in two forms. The first was a single tomb in the mountains of southwest France. The second was the agricultural footprint of an order that had spent 2 centuries planting vines across half a continent. In May of 2008, a sealed burial in the mountains of the Languedoc region of southwest France was reported to the international press by an archaeological team working under the direction of the documentary project Bloodline. The tomb contained a mummified corpse laid on a rose-colored plinth covered by a shroud bearing the distinct red cross of the Knights Templar. The body was surrounded by wooden chests, several of them open, containing gold chalices and coins. The Languedoc was the heartland of the Order's French operation, the region where the Templar commanderies had been densest, and the region into which, after the arrests of October 1307, much of the Order's portable wealth and material was rumored to have been hidden. The tomb fit the geographic and ritual profile of a high-status Templar burial dating to the period of the Order's destruction. Hair follicles were extracted from the skull and sent to the Paleo-DNA laboratory at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario, where mitochondrial DNA was successfully amplified from the sample. The genetic material was real. The Templar context was real. The chain of custody from the tomb to the laboratory was independently documented. The agricultural infrastructure was older and larger. The Templar vineyard footprint in southern France is archaeologically and documentarily massive. At Villedieu, in the northern Vaucluse, the Templar church and fortifications still stand and are still in daily use by the village. Across Provence, Languedoc, and the Rhône Valley, the order planted vast vineyards, standardized winemaking techniques, and improved the quality of regional wine to a degree that reshaped the European wine economy. The University of Bologna has academically certified one continuous Templar wine lineage, the Vinum Templarium project in Emilia-Romagna, which reconstructs an order-era recipe using historic grape varieties and verified cultivation methods. The vines the Templars planted in the 12th and 13th centuries are, in many cases, still tended by families in the same valleys. The institutional infrastructure around the drink is documented in the Code de Divino regional records and in independent scholarship on the order's daily life. Each Templar possessed 2 wine goblets. One was for everyday meals. The second was reserved for ritual use. deployed in religious services and what the Code Divino sources describe as specific occasions. The two-goblet system is the architectural signature of a controlled administration practice. A drink consumed casually does not require a separate cup. A drink consumed in ritual context, on prescribed days, in prescribed quantities, does. The infrastructure for administering the elixir was institutional, not personal. The herbal profile is documented alongside it. Code Divino's records of Templar wine practice list anise, rosemary, cinnamon, cloves, and honey as additives mixed into the ritual wine alongside the aloe and the hemp identified in the Schweitzer, Barcroft, and D. Chico reconstructions. The herbal additions were regional, drawing on the southern French and Mediterranean botanical inventory available in the preceptories. The administration was institutional, governed by the order's hierarchy and tied to the ritual calendar. The drink was prepared by the order. The cup was owned by the order. The wine was administered in the chapel and the refectory, not at the man's discretion. This is the same institutional pattern that the Norse berserker evidence revealed. The elixir was not a personal habit. It was a tool of a system. The order grew the grapes, fermented the wine, prepared the additives, owned the goblets, and distributed the cup in ritual context to men who had been recruited, trained, and deployed by the order's hierarchy. The drink was the output of an institution. The man who drank it was the output of an institution. When the institution ended, the production line ended with it. The institution ended on a specific date. On Friday, October 13, 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the simultaneous arrest of every Templar in France. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned alive in Paris on March 18, 1314. The Languedoc commanderies were seized and their assets transferred. The vineyards passed to other hands. The two-goblet system disappeared. The recipe scattered into legend, surfacing centuries later in the secondary scholarship that reconstructed it. The drink had been identified. The infrastructure had been mapped. The institution had been destroyed. The men themselves remained. For most of the modern era, the Templars had been treated in popular and scholarly writing as a category apart from the populations they were drawn from. The order recruited from the nobility. Its commanders carried titles tracing back to specific French and Norman houses. Its founding members included men whose lineages were documented in the genealogies of the great families of Champagne, Burgundy, and the Anglo-Norman aristocracy. The mythology that grew up around the order in the centuries after its destruction emphasized the bloodline. The Templar in this reading was not a recruit drawn from the regional population. He was a hereditary aristocrat, biologically distinct from the peasantry of the regions he occupied, descended from a separate stock that had carried the institution forward by inheritance. This was a theory built, like most pre-genetic claims about historical populations, in the absence of the evidence required to test it. And like most such theories, it did not survive the arrival of the evidence. The DNA work on Crusader-era burials, including the Lakehead Languedoc material and the broader Mediterranean Crusader cemetery studies conducted across the 2010s and 2020s, has produced a different picture. Crusader cemeteries in the Levant, excavated in Lebanon and in the territories of the former Crusader states, have yielded skeletal remains that show significant gene flow between the European combatants and the local populations they encountered. The Crusaders who came east fathered children, intermarried with the populations they lived among, and left a genetic signal that is present in the modern populations of Lebanon, Syria, and the surrounding regions. The genetic mixing was real and is documented. The European side picture is parallel. The skeletal remains identified through grave goods, burial position, and contextual archaeology as belonging to Templar and Crusader-era warriors in southern France did not show the genetic signature that the older theories had predicted. They were not concentrated in any unusual ancestry cluster. They did not carry markers indicating descent from a separate noble caste. They sat squarely within the mainstream genetic distributions of medieval southern French and broader Western European populations, indistinguishable at the level of ancestry from the farmers, the vintners, and the artisans buried in nearby contexts. The implication was specific. The Templar was not a genetic outlier. He was not the product of a separate hereditary line maintained across generations by the order. He was a local man, drawn from the population that worked the Languedoc vineyards and farmed the Provençal valleys, and what set him apart from his neighbors was not his bloodline, but the institution that had claimed him. The capacity for the Templar combat record was not in the genes. It was in the system that recruited him, fed him the elixir, drilled him in the formations of the heavy cavalry charge, and deployed him on command across the Mediterranean theater. This finding inverted the question that had occupied the Templar mythology for 7 centuries. The interesting thing about the Templar was no longer who he was descended from. The interesting thing was what had been done to him. The transformation that the chronicle record described, the disproportionate combat success, the documented longevity, the resistance to wound infection and chronic disease, was not the expression of an inherited trait. It was the output of an institutional pipeline that converted ordinary southern Frenchmen into a specific kind of soldier. The Templar, in this reading, was not a hereditary warrior. He was a product. And the production line ran through the preceptories, the vineyards, the refectories, the goblets, and the chapel rituals that administered the elixir on prescribed days. The order grew the grapes, prepared the additives, owned the cup, and gave it to men whose ancestors had farmed the same valleys for generations. The institutional inputs were specific, documented, and replicable. The genetic input was the local population. This is the same finding that the ancient DNA work on the Norse berserker burials produced in Norway. The warrior was a product, not a creature. The transformation lived in the institution, not in the bloodline. When the institution ended, the production line ended. But the men themselves did not end. Their genetic material did not end. The bodies that the order had recruited from the southern French valleys and used in 2 centuries of Mediterranean warfare were the bodies of local men, and when the order was destroyed, the men who survived went back to those valleys. The order ended on a specific date in October of 1307. The men did not end on that date. They scattered, hid, integrated, and disappeared into the populations from which they had been recruited. The DNA could now show where. The answer is the part of the story that the title promised, and it is also the part that requires the most careful framing. Population-scale genetic studies of present-day French populations, drawing on tens of thousands of sequenced genomes from regional biobanks across France, have established direct and traceable continuity between the medieval populations of southern France and the modern populations of the same regions. The genetic distance between a 13th century Languedocian and a 21st century Languedocian is, in most cases, statistically negligible. The Y chromosome haplogroups documented in Crusader-era burials in the Mediterranean theater, including the lineages identified through the Lakehead mitochondrial work and the broader Mediterranean Crusader cemetery studies, are present at high frequencies in modern men from the same geographic regions. Specific lineages traced through ancient DNA have been matched to living descendants in the same valleys where the original Templar commanderies operated. The framing here matters, and it is worth stating carefully. The persistence of Templar-era ancestry in modern southern France is not a claim that there is a Templar gene, or that modern Languedocians or Provençals carry some hereditary martial trait, or that the descendants of Templar combatants are in any way biologically different from their neighbors. The Templar, like the berserker, was a product of an institution. The institution required the order, the rule, the preceptory, the vineyard, the elixir, the cup, and the global infrastructure of commanderies that connected the Holy Land to the Iberian Peninsula to the British Isles. None of those things are encoded in DNA. What is encoded in DNA is ancestry, and ancestry is a record of who fathered whom, not of what they did for a living. The Templar bloodline is not a warrior's bloodline. It is simply a southern French one. The continuity is documented and specific. The Templars were celibate by the rule, but the enforcement of that provision was uneven, particularly in the southern French and Iberian preceptories, where the order's institutional grip was looser. Children fathered before recruitment, illegitimate offspring during service, and the broader Crusader lineage that overlapped with the Templar membership pool, all of these flowed back into the southern French gene pool. After the arrests of October 1307 and the executions of 1314, surviving Templars went into hiding, integrated into local populations, and disappeared into the same villages they had been recruited from. The Lakehead mitochondrial DNA work and the broader Crusader genetic studies confirm that the absorption was real and the chain was unbroken. The contrast with the cultural memory of the Templar is striking. In popular history, in fantasy literature, in the Da Vinci Code and its imitators, in the entire post-medieval mythology of Friday the 13th, the Templar is treated as a vanished elite, a secret bloodline preserved through Masonic and esoteric channels, or a hereditary line maintained in the shadows by families like the Sinclairs, or a cult extinguished entirely by Philip IV in a single autumn. The figure has the same narrative shape as the Atlantis of Plato or the Cathars of the same Languedoc, a population whose disappearance is the central fact of the story. The DNA tells a different story. The disappearance never happened. What ended was not a population. It was a practice. The Vinum Templarium project in Emilia-Romagna, the surviving Templar church at Villedieu in the Vaucluse, the standing fortifications and the documented vineyards across Languedoc and Provence, all of these are the visible architectural and agricultural inheritance of the order. The genetic inheritance is the population that surrounds them. The men who tend the vines today, in the same valleys the order planted in the 12th century, are the direct descendants of the men the order recruited and used and absorbed. The vines are still there. The descendants are still there. The wine is still made. What the genetic evidence does show is that the figure of the Templar, as a category of person, was never a separate thing from the broader southern French population in the first place. He was drawn from it, transformed by it, and reabsorbed into it when the institution that defined him was abolished. The men who survived the suppression, who lived past the typical lifespan of a combatant in that role, settled into the same villages and farmed the same valleys as everyone else. They married. They had children. The genetic signal of their lineages flowed back into the population pool from which they had been recruited. What ended in 1307 was the order. What did not end was the population that had produced it. The men went home. Returned to the commandery. The CUP passed in silence. The night before a column rode out toward a battlefield. Palm wine in the Holy Land. Grape wine in France. Aloe pulp dark in the bottom of the goblet. Hemp resin from a plant that the Sufis of the Levant called Holy Jerusalem. The rule said wine in moderation. The rule was the visible document. The textbook image of the warrior monk who fought sober on faith alone was wrong. The drink was real. The pharmacology was specific. The institution that produced it was destroyed in October of 1307 and never reassembled. The men who drank it died, fathered children, and were absorbed into the southern French valleys the order had drawn them from. The real surprise of the Templar story is the disappearance and the fact that the disappearance never actually happened. The institution ended. The men did not.